All right, so I've got the live stream started. I have the WebEx meeting started, so we've got a lot to cover today. Number of things that I want to discuss. So, because we had to shut down due to a positive COVID test one day, and then I had you watch the pricing channels, or the pricing lecture online. We covered that. I was supposed to cover services before pricing, and I forgot to do that. I should have had you watch that video instead, but I had you watch the pricing lecture. So we'll cover services today. In my first class, if I had gotten through channels, I was going to have channels on this next exam. We were supposed to have an exam last Thursday. Obviously, we couldn't have an exam last Thursday because I hadn't covered services or channels. And we had no school, and everything was canceled according to the president. We were supposed to put anything up on D2L or do anything like that. So the exam will be this Thursday, which means that you will have class time this Thursday to complete the exam. There will not be an essay on this exam. However, there will be word problems since it has a pricing chapter, the stuff that you all hated when you were in elementary and junior high and high school, the word problems. There will be word problems that will ask you to calculate things like final price, profit, things like that, that are in the pricing chapters. So there will be word problems on the exam that you'll have to calculate. So that'll be due a week from Thursday, but you will have class time on Thursday to work through that exam. It will be posted on D2L like the others. Obviously, because I lost power for 8 days in Guthrie, we only had 2 linemen in Logan County. I was not able to grade the article reviews and things like that because I only had power insofar as I charged up my laptop and I had a jumper box that I could charge up. So anyway, I'll get to that as quickly as I can. So we'll cover on the third exam, managing products, services, and brands, services, marketing, pricing. It will not include channels. We'll put channels with retailing and wholesaling, and that actually makes more sense anyways because retailing and wholesaling are part of channels marketing. So we'll talk about that a week from today. So Thursday, we will not meet in class. You will have that time available to take the exam. So I'll point that out. Also today, since we're talking about services marketing, it is enormously important. One of the most important things in services marketing are actually governmental services. And today is an election day, and so you have the opportunity to go and vote. For those of you who are registered to vote and are citizens of the United States and the state of Oklahoma, you can go to, and there's a number of things that are important in terms of voting. Let me turn this back on. It's not just voting for president and the major offices. We have a United States Senate race, for example, in this state. All of the congressional races, are up. All 435 members of Congress are up. Some races have not drawn opponents. There is a major race. There is one really competitive race in Oklahoma, and many of you probably live in that district. It's the district that's currently represented by Kendra Horn, and she's being challenged by Oklahoma State Senator Stephanie Bice. So those are important elections that you should participate in. There are also 2 state questions. So if you go to ok.gov/elections, you can get the text of the state questions. These are really important. I'm going to tell you that we do not have a democracy in this country. We have elements of democracy in this country, and one of those elements that we have, particularly in the state of Oklahoma, not every state has this, we do have elements of direct democracy in Oklahoma that other states don't have. Some do, some don't. We have 2 forms of direct democracy. We have referendum, which allows the people of the state of Oklahoma, if the legislature passes a law that they don't agree with, to petition the government to have that put on the ballot and recalled. Or we have initiative petitions that allow the citizens to take their own initiative, put a measure up, and we've seen an enormous change in the state of Oklahoma in the last few years through initiative in terms of medical marijuana, right? I never thought that would have passed when I was a kid growing up in Oklahoma. It passed overwhelmingly. I thought it was, when it came up to it, I thought it was going to pass, but I didn't think it would pass by the margin that it passed. And by the way, that initiative, we have the most liberal medical marijuana law in the nation. There are states that have recreational marijuana that are more liberal, but that's recreational, not medical. Of the medical marijuana states, we have the most liberal. You can get it for any reason, as I understand it. Any doctor can, for anxiety, sleeplessness, things like that. Most states that have just medical marijuana limit it to a handful of conditions like cancer, macular degeneration, and epilepsy, and things like that. So we have a very liberal medical marijuana law. There are two ballot initiatives this time around that are important. One deals with sentencing reform. And so I will tell you that largely we define who we are. I teach political marketing. I've taught that for a number of years, and I've run political campaigns, which is a service. We're going to talk about services marketing today. That is a services marketing aspect, and I've taught it for a long time. We largely define who we are as a people by what we tend to criminalize and how we treat criminals, right? So this is an enormously important initiative for you all to think about and vote on. It's sentencing reform. So for example, for a long period of time, almost all 50 states had prohibitions against homosexual sodomy, right? Some, like Oklahoma, had prohibitions against other forms of sodomy, even between men and women. Oklahoma's sodomy law, for example, defined it as any form of sexual contact other than in the missionary position. Right? That was our sodomy law, so it could apply to heterosexual couples as well. In 1986, in a case called Bowers versus Hardwick, the United States Supreme Court affirmed those sodomy laws. Are those really enforceable? No, right? Because sex doesn't take place in public. But we tend to define who we are by what we criminalize and then how we treat those people. So this is an important one that you should read and think about. Also is how we're going to fund Medicaid expansion. The voters, through an initiative petition, the state legislature voted to not expand Medicaid, which is health care for poor people in the state. They chose not to take the matching funds. It's a 90-10 match from the federal government. The state legislature said that they weren't going to do that. Voters in Oklahoma overrode the legislature and passed a Medicaid expansion. Now the question is, how do we fund that Medicaid expansion? This would involve money that came from the tobacco settlement, TSET. Currently, the formula is that 25% of the tobacco settlement fund from the tobacco companies that we get goes to the legislature and the attorney general, and 75% goes to the TSET fund to do things like engage in smoking cessation programs and cancer research for smoking-related illnesses. This would change the formula, and it would give 75% to the legislature, but it would have to be used for Medicaid expansion. So those are two important things that are on the ballot. Obviously, elected officials are important. In the past, and I put this up on the board so that you will know, I don't think that we have a whole lot of democracy in the United States. We have elements of democracy, but we have a Republican form of government, and I don't mean Republican as it's currently defined by most people. Most people define Republican government as a representative democracy, where you vote for representatives who represent you and then make laws. We don't even have that in this country. We've never had that in this country, right? The president has never been popularly elected. If the president were popularly elected, who would be president right now? Overwhelmingly. Who would be president today if we had popularly elected presidents? Hillary Clinton won by 3 million votes, right? She would have been president if we had a popular, we don't. We have something called the Electoral College, which allows electors, so when you go vote today, you're actually voting for a slate of electors. Oklahoma is a winner-take-all state. So whoever gets 50% plus one vote wins the entire slate of electors. The electors will meet in the Electoral College. There are 50 campuses of the Electoral College. They meet in the state legislatures, the state capitals, and then they will cast their ballots, which they will transmit to Congress for president. The third branch of government, the judicial branch, which is listed in Article 3 of the United States Constitution, is not elected. It's a third co-equal branch. It is appointed for life by the president with the advice and consent of the United States Senate. United States senators were not directly elected by the people until 1913. Senators were elected by state legislators, which meant that if you had a split between the House of Representatives and the Senate in the state, they didn't send a senator to Congress. They were not directly elected. So only one branch, one half of one branch of government has ever been elected by the people, and that's the United States House of Congress. Senators are still not really democratically elected because senators don't represent people. If they did, we would have the same number of people represented by a senator as we have population. That's not the way. They represent states, right? So a vote in Montana where there are less than 1 million people counts for a lot more in the United States Senate than a vote from Oklahoma where we have approaching 4 million people. And it's also important to think about this. So in 1912, we got a proposal from Congress to directly elect senators. And this is important because a lot of times you'll hear presidents. President Bush, for example, said that he supported a school prayer amendment and that he was going to push for a definition of marriage amendment. This is the way the Constitution works. Amendments are proposed either by Congress, 2/3 of both houses voting to propose an amendment, or 2/3 of the legislatures in the various states can petition Congress to call for a constitutional convention. The president has nothing to do with it. Donald Trump has said he would have a constitutional amendment so he can have 4 more years after this, right? President has nothing to do with this. It's then ratified by either 3/4 of the state legislatures or 3/4 of conventions in the United States that are elected by the citizens of each state. This has never happened. All amendments have been proposed this way. This has happened only once. The 21st Amendment, which repealed the 18th Amendment, which was prohibition, was submitted to state constitutional conventions. And the way that works is it's an up or down vote. They cannot amend the amendments in the states. It's an up or down vote, right? So to the extent that we have some democracy or an element of democracy, we are a republic in that we have elements of monarchy, we have elements of aristocracy, that would be the Senate and the United States Supreme Court, and then we have elements of democracy, which would be the House of Representatives. It's important that you go and exercise your right to vote. If you don't, the element of democracy that we have may fail. And in Oklahoma, we actually have a lot of democracy, right? Because we truly do have representative democracy in the states because state senators represent equal number of people. State members of houses represent equal numbers of people. All states except one have bicameral legislatures like we have the federal government. What's the one exception? What has a unicameral legislature? Anybody know? Nebraska. Nebraska has a unicameral legislature. Every other state has a bicameral legislature. Those representatives represent equal numbers of people. Those senators represent equal numbers of people. And governors are actually directly elected. And in Oklahoma, we have an additional element of democracy in terms of initiative and referendum. So we're talking about services. Government provides services. You need to participate in government in order to get the services that you want or the services that you don't want, as the case may be. So if you are registered to vote and eligible to vote today, I encourage you to go vote. The polls are open till 7. If you go to the website and you don't know where you vote because you've registered and you don't remember, you can go to the state website and you can get voter information. If you go there, there is a OK Voter portal. You can click on that. You can enter your name, and it will tell you where you are registered to vote, which precinct you're registered in. All right? Any questions about that? Let's talk about services then. And we'll use some examples of governmental services. So, services are the intangible activities or benefits that organizations provide to satisfy customers' needs in exchange for money or something else of value. So governments provide services as well, but they don't do it necessarily directly for money. They use our tax dollars, so there is some money, but you can't, it's not a one-for-one exchange the way it is with businesses. And nonprofits also provide services, and they do it for donations, but they don't necessarily, it's not a direct exchange, but there's something of value, right? So we provide services in the government for things like roads, Medicaid, schools, police protection, ambulance services, fire protection, water districts, all of that are governmental services. Some of those are one-for-one exchange, in that if you get water, you probably pay. If you're a rural water, you pay to a rural water district. If you're in Edmond or Guthrie or Oklahoma City, you pay water bills to the city. And that's sort of a business side of government that's generally done through what's called the public works function of government, which is the quasi business or quasi-private aspect of the government. So when I was a vice mayor in the city of Guthrie, for example, there's two aspects of city government. You have a city council, and then you also, the city council functions as the board of trustees for the public works. So you'd have two meetings. You have the city council meeting, and then we would adjourn and go instantly into public works, which is a quasi-public, quasi-private function of government that provides services. Other services are purely governmental, police services. We don't charge you when the police come out for a unit of police service, right? It's if you get your house broken into, we don't charge you $25 for each police report you file or things like that. So something else of value, what's the something else of value? Well, it's provided through tax dollars and through, citizen participation. Services scholars like Mary Jo Bittner argue that all goods are really services. Again, just like branding scholars argue that the most important business decision a business will make is selecting a brand name, and I've said that that's absolutely not true. There are lots of companies. Chesapeake has fantastic branding. They're going broke. They have filed for bankruptcy. They will probably not be around in the next 1 to 5 years. They may emerge from bankruptcy. I sort of doubt it, right? They have a great brand. They had shitty products, right? I mean, not capable of producing a product, never produced a profit. Great brand, bad business model, still went broke. Services scholars likewise argue that everything is really a service, all goods. So I went and got iced tea at Burger King. What's the service that's provided here in this good, the iced tea? Well, it's quenching your thirst, right? Or providing something that you like to drink, that you enjoy as a beverage. That's a service. You don't like the thing. You're not like Gollum in Lord of the Rings, for those of you who've seen this, right? This is little creature. He actually starts out as a sort of normal individual. I'm not sure he's human, but normal individual. He finds this ring, right? And he then, my precious, he loves the ring for itself. And he loses the ring, and it drives him mad because he loves the ring in and of itself. Most of us, we don't value the iced tea I don't sit here and love the iced tea. I like it because it quenches my thirst. I like the way it tastes, right? I like the service that it provides, right? So is there something that you can think of that you value in and of itself? The one good that I can think of that you might value in and of itself and not for the service it provides is art. You might value art for its own sake in and of itself. You look at art and it's something that moves you internally. Although Bittner would argue that most people value art not because they like it for themselves, unless you're talking about something like the Thomas Crown Affair, where this wealthy man in the Thomas Crown Affair, he's a very wealthy individual, but he steals. He's an art thief. He goes and steals great works of art. And obviously, he can't display them in his home because people would find out and he would go to jail. So he values the art in and of itself. But most things we value for the service that it provides us, right? 46% of the US GDP, and this is an old statistic, it's probably gone up since your textbook was actually published, is in services. So we have transformed from an industrial society to a post-industrial economy that's largely based on services. The value of services has increased over 100% since 1990, and it's increasing at an exponentially larger rate. $722 billion in 2014 was in services, and it amounts in international trade to an area where we actually have a trade surplus. So it's one of the areas where we actually have a surplus, and the value of our economy is really in financial, legal, banking, accounting, software, things like that, those kinds of services. And that's an increasingly larger percentage. When we talk about services, we talk about 4 I's. Just as there are 4 P's in marketing, we organize the overall discipline of marketing into 4 P's, which often form the subfields of marketing or the sub-subfields of marketing. So we have product, price, place, and promotion. And there are scholars who study just aspects of that. How do we involve or how do we come up with pricing models, right? I told you that with regard to price, which is maybe the most important of the 4 P's, because it represents what you are willing to sacrifice to get what you want, there's no unifying theory. And it depends on the company's goals and objectives, or the nonprofit's goals and objectives, or the government's goals and objectives, how things are priced, right? What is a unit of police protection? How do we price that? Well, it's through taxes. It's an allocation of those tax dollars. There's no a priori model that we can use to do that. Just like we organize subfields of marketing with those 4 P's, we organize services and the way we study services around the 4 I's in many instances. So the 4 I's of service are intangibility, inconsistency, inseparability, and inventory. And all of these are interrelated. Just as the 4 P's, although we have studies, for example, scholars who study nothing but how you go through product development. What is the best way of bringing the product to market? And there are scholars who focus strictly on that. They are integrated, right? I mean, you have to have a product. You have to have something to exchange for marketing to occur. You have to have 2 people, and you have to have a willingness to be satisfied, right? It doesn't have to necessarily be a tangible thing. So we have scholars that study just the product. We also have scholars that in services study just one of these aspects of service, but they are all interrelated. So obviously, in order for marketing to occur, you have to have a product. By product, we mean something of value. It could be your time. It could be a service. It could be feelings. It can be exchanges of ideas, things like that. But you have to have something. There has to be some price component. If nothing else, there is an opportunity cost, right? If you are spending time with Jill, your friend, you can't necessarily be spending that time with your family, right? Or there's an opportunity cost there. It has to have some kind of place. There's a temporal aspect. These are all interrelated. So product, price, place, and you have to have some way of promoting it. Maybe just communication, but they're all interrelated. And all 4 of these are also interrelated. Although we have a tendency to study them and think about them as distinct, you have to realize that they have these sort of interrelated aspects when you think about it. And when you develop services to bring to market, you have to think about all 4 of them. So services generally can't be held, touched, or seen before the purchase decision. Now, some of them may involve touch, things like a massage. Obviously, you're going to have some sensation from it. But can you experience it before the purchase? Not really, right? You have to purchase. So several years ago, although my mother is Jewish and although my sister-in-law is also Jewish, my mother loves Christmas. Any excuse to spend money and buy things and give gifts, my mother loves. So much to the dismay of our rabbi, who doesn't think that Jews should say things like Merry Christmas. My mother is all about Christmas. And my brother and I are dutifully walking through the mall carrying packages one Christmas about 5 years ago. And there are these guys in the mall that are out giving massages, right? And we thought, well, that's, we're sore, we'll get a massage. It was the most horrific experience of my life. I couldn't wait for the 20 minutes to be over. I mean, it's like he was doing this like Rolfing massage, not like, like we're talking about really deep tissue and grinding his elbow into the small of my back. And I couldn't, but I didn't know that before I paid, the $30 for 20 minutes or whatever it was, even though there's a touch aspect to it. And then a lot of services have absolutely no temporal aspect to them, right? When you're talking about political marketing and political services, a lot of that, how do you measure or how do you touch, see, feel police protection, right? I mean, most of you have very limited experience or exposure to the police. You probably don't live in a high crime neighborhood. And so, but it's there, right? It's not something that you touch or see or feel or hear or see or taste every day, but it's there. So services tend to be performance-based, which leads to credence properties, aspects of services that are very difficult to evaluate. Things like medical and legal services. How are you going to evaluate that? How do you evaluate the efficacy of your police services? A lot of people would say, for example, if you lived in New York City in the 1990s, there was a huge murder problem. And you might say the police are completely ineffective. Well, the fact that you have a high crime, does that mean that the police are completely ineffective? Or does it mean that you have citizens that are ineffective? When I was getting my PhD at New Mexico State is about 35 miles from El Paso. El Paso sits on the border with Juarez, right? When I was a kid growing up in northern New Mexico, we used to travel. I had cousins in southern New Mexico, and we would go down to Las Cruces, and we would go over to El Paso, and we would go over to Juarez a lot. It was very safe. Juarez had last year something like 2,300 murders in Juarez. We didn't cross the border to go to Juarez when I was in the doctoral program. We went to Palomas, which was a little bit safer, but it was still, now you might say the police are completely ineffective there. And in fact, the Mexican government has issued warnings against their own people, to their people, warning them that the police forces are corrupt in places like Juarez. But that's not necessarily true, right? I mean, you could have a highly effective police force that individual officers are doing their duties, but they're overwhelmed by what? The drug cartels. So how do you evaluate those kinds of things, right? That becomes important, those credence properties. Inconsistency, along with intangibility, is inconsistency. Goods may be good or bad, but they're generally consistent. If you go over to the food court and you buy the crappy Chick-fil-A chicken sandwich, tool of the devil that it is, and you then walk across to the other tool of the devil, Starbucks, and get their crappy coffee, it's bad, right? It's crappy chicken on white bread and crappy coffee. But it's consistent. They are consistently frying their crappy chicken and consistently brewing their crappy coffee in the same way. And that's what people like. Most people don't like, and I will tell you, I'm a foodie. I am the executive chef for my family's business, so I cook a lot. I know how to cook good chicken. It's not Chick-fil-A's way. But, you know, most people don't think McDonald's is great. I will tell you that in every objective taste test that's been done, McDonald's coffee is far better. It always beats out Starbucks. And you know what beats out both of them? Dunkin' Donuts coffee, right? Good coffee, Dunkin', great coffee, Starbucks, tool of the devil, crappy coffee. But most people don't think of McDonald's as being great for anything. But they still go there because it's consistent. You know what a hamburger at McDonald's is going to taste like. A Big Mac is 2 all-beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun, and it tastes the same in New York as it does in Oklahoma, right? It's consistent. Goods may be consistent. They may be bad. It may be McDonald's. I don't think anybody just thinks, I actually think Big Macs are actually pretty good. I think they actually taste pretty good. I actually like them. I think McDonald's breakfast is pretty good. My mother, who is also a foodie, my mother loves food, and she will tell you that she thinks McDonald's pancakes are the best that she's ever had. She thinks they're better than Jimmy's Egg, And she likes Jimmy's Egg. There's a lot of stuff at Jimmy's Egg that they do well. The garbage breakfast, for example, I think they do extremely well. But she thinks McDonald's has got like the lightest, fluffiest. She thinks they're better than my pancakes. Mine are homemade. You know, she thinks they're better than my pancakes. But they're consistent. Services are not the same way. Now we try to have consistency in some instances, but a lot of it is highly dependent upon how much the service can be routine. So it's very easy to, for example, dry cleaning services are a service, and it's pretty easy to standardize that, right? I mean, you only put a certain amount of clothes in the dry cleaning, and by the way, dry cleaning is a misnomer. It's not actually dry cleaning. It uses fluid in the process, so it's not that it's dry. I don't know why they call it dry cleaning, but it's chemically processed cleaning, right? And if you put too much of the chemical process, it will burn holes in the clothes, right? So we can standardize that. We know sort of what the ratio should be. But how do you standardize massage services? Now, Massage Envy tries to. And this is actually one of the things that I sort of started to do a little study on is how has the branding of Massage Envy changed the perception of what a massage was? When I was growing up as a kid, massages were given at very expensive day spas and maybe high-end resorts and things like that. Massage Envy is basically the McDonald's of the massage business, right? But still, it's a unique experience, and a lot of it is dependent upon what you want. There are people who maybe love to have somebody press into the small of their back with their elbow in full force. I mean, there are people who like deep tissue, Rolfing type massages. I'm not one of them, right? How do you standardize things like that? They do try. So it makes it difficult, which means that it makes the quality difficult to evaluate. So how do you evaluate, for example, the quality of a doctor's services? How do you evaluate the quality of a lawyer's service? Well, I'll tell you what students generally, I usually use lawyers because I'm a lawyer, right? So I usually use legal service as an example, and students always tell me the number one answer that comes out every semester is you evaluate it by whether or not they win or lose. The dumbest people in my law school class, the ones who are candidates for natural deselection, have amazing win-loss ratios. I was working here full-time as the assistant equity officer when I went to law school, so I couldn't go to OU. I was admitted to OU, but OU does not let you work for your first year in law school, and I didn't want to give up my job. So I went to OCU, which would allow you to work and go part-time, right? When I started at OCU, the tuition alone was $700 a credited hour. That did not include fees or books. When I graduated, the tuition was $900 a credited hour. The average law school student who went to a private institution at that point in time came out $150,000 in debt. I was lucky my parents paid for about 75%, and I have a small amount of debt as a result of going to law school. But my parents paid for both my brother and I to go to law school. And we both went to private law schools. There were all of these morons. I mean, they were at the bottom of the law school class, and they all decided they were going to go be prosecutors because they were, you know, truth, justice, and the American way. We're true believers. Do you know what a prosecutor makes, an ADA makes? $35,000 a year. If you are so stupid that you cannot figure out that you are going to come out with $150,000 in debt and you cannot service that debt on a $35,000 a year salary, you are a candidate for natural deselection. The good Lord should take you out. They have great win-loss ratios. They win 98% of the cases that they try. Why is that? Because the people that they're prosecuting are dumber than they are. In the medical field, general practitioners, your family docs, generally don't lose people. You generally don't die of a hangnail. or the sniffles, and they're generally not the brightest docs. The brightest docs go into things like radiology. And if you go into medical, radiological oncology for pancreatic cancer victims, you're going to lose 98% of your patients. And you may be really smart. So it's really difficult to evaluate this. When I was the vice president for the American Education Corporation, one of my colleagues was getting a divorce. He was another vice president for sales and marketing for a product called Advancer, which was our higher education product. And he came to me and he said, I'm getting a divorce. I need a recommendation for a good lawyer. And he made a lot of money. And I said, well, there's the two best divorce lawyers in Oklahoma City are Arnold Fagan. You can't afford him. He only basically does people who are worth $50 million and above. And the other one is Anita Sanders. You can afford her. He got on Angie's list, and he comes back to me about 2 hours later and says, well, I got on Angie's list, and I looked up Anita Sanders, and she has horrible ratings on Angie's list. Can you give me somebody else? And I said, Paul, if you want the best divorce lawyer that you can afford, and he made a lot of money, he just was not Arnold Fagan wealthy, right? He's since retired. It's Anita Sanders. And he said, but she has these horrible ratings. Well, people who are getting a divorce are not in a position to evaluate legal services. Oklahoma is not a community property state, but we function like a community property state. We are not a no-fault divorce state, but we function like a no-fault divorce state. What does that mean? That means that when you get a divorce, it doesn't matter whether you charge your spouse with adultery, cruelty, abandonment, anything, or irreconcilable differences. The outcome is going to be the same. You're going to get 50%. And when 50% of your crap walks out the door, you are not happy. You are not rational, and you are not happy. Divorce attorneys all have bad ratings on Angie's list. Because when your car leaves and your home is sold and your kids are no longer there, I don't have children, I would probably think that's an advantage, that they were gone. But having gone through divorce 3 times, I can tell you, when 50% of your stuff, when I have to sell my boat, you're not happy. Let me show you an example of this is an attorney letter, a friend of mine who's since deceased. He was a judge in Oklahoma at one time. This is his contract. This is what he came up with as his contract for divorce law. I tried to practice divorce law. I did it for one time. This individual came in and started crying, and I said, I cannot deal with you while you're like this. You've got to come back when you're rational. When you stop crying, you come and see me, because I can't help you. This is a contract for divorce for 1975, so you'll have to remember that these fees were pretty high at the time. You've retained me to represent you in a divorce action, and I have tried to explain the law as well as the practical ramifications to the best of my ability. So as to eliminate all doubt, I have set down the more important aspects of our attorney-client relationship. A minimum fee for an uncontested divorce is $200. That's a irreconcilable differences. We are technically not a no-fault divorce state. What that means is you're both at fault. However, you can charge your spouse with adultery. I had a client who wanted to do that. He was crying too. You've got to leave and come back when you're more rational. $20 costs, $120 down, $35 an hour. Minimum fee for contested divorce, same as above, $500 for trial. Telephone calls, $35 per hour. Minimum charge $875 for 15 minutes. Writing letters, $25 per letter. Office consultation, $35 an hour. Minimum charge of $875 is above. To my clients concerning divorce. Ordinarily, divorce is a serious social trauma, but obtaining one under Oklahoma law can be very simple and inexpensive. I am not an agency for revenge, a detective agency, or a crying towel, but a lawyer. Bothering me with the petty details and trivia wastes my time and thus increases your divorce costs. I will be happy to listen to any and all ranting, raving, gnashing of teeth, etc. at a rate of $35 per hour, payable prior to divorce. If you insist upon running up the cost, such overages must be paid within 1 week, or I will dismiss your lawsuit, fire myself as your attorney, and sue you for the balance of my fee. You will receive your divorce decree when all fees and costs are paid. That pretty well describes what divorce is. It is a serious social trauma. Divorce doesn't happen in church, and people are not happy. How do you evaluate? Angie's List is not a great way to evaluate a divorce lawyer. I think you have to have another lawyer who knows something about it to be able to evaluate. Most people don't have that luxury, right? So services are very difficult to evaluate. Dry cleaning services, easy, right? Did they snap the buttons on my suit? Did they put holes in it from the dry cleaning fluid? That's easy. Anything else that requires value co-creation, you know, I practiced criminal law for a very short period of time. When I first got my license in Oklahoma, the way we did public defender was if you were an attorney living in a county and you were listed, you got appointed. And I rapidly learned this rule. It's called TALL, the rule of TALL. They all lie. If your client is talking to you, they are probably lying to you. Not that they intend to necessarily, but they're probably lying to you. So I got appointed to this case, and there was very little evidence. The guy, you know, we probably could have taken it to trial and won, but for one minor fact. I said, did you talk to anybody when you were in jail? No, didn't talk to anybody. Did you confess to the police when they arrested you? No, didn't confess. So we go to the preliminary hearing, the arraignment first, and I said, well, there's very little evidence here, Your Honor. I would like my client to be released on a PR bond. The district attorney, the ADA, who's a lesser attorney than me, stood up and says, well, Your Honor, we have a confession, and so we're going to ask for $150,000 in bond. I said, what? I mean, my client, did you confess? No. So he hands me this piece of paper, and at the top of it, it says statement. And I show it to my client. He says, that there's a statement, not a confession. The statement was, I did it. Doesn't matter how brilliant a lawyer I am at this point, right? You're going to jail, right? So when you have these more difficult services, medical, dental, legal, it becomes very difficult to evaluate this stuff. And it requires that you engage in value co-creation. You have to tell your lawyer the truth. If you don't, they can't help you. In the early days of and we've seen this in an age of COVID. The parallels between COVID and HIV are striking. My mother owned all of these rental properties in Santa Fe, New Mexico when I was growing up. She had a bunch of apartment complexes, and the second person to die of what they called at the time GRID, gay related immune deficiency, was a man who lived in one of her apartments. They didn't call it HIV or AIDS at that point. They didn't even know what caused it. And gay men, when they went to a doctor, wouldn't tell people that they were gay. They wouldn't tell people that they had this. And you cannot treat people who do not, because there was such a stigma associated with that. In 1986, in a case called Bowers versus Hardwick, the Chief Justice of the United States, almost every state had anti-sodomy laws at that point in time. Again, what we choose to criminalize is a reflection of who we are as a society. All states had these anti-sodomy laws that made homosexual sodomy a crime. In Oklahoma, heterosexual sodomy was also a crime. Sodomy was defined as anything other than sex in the missionary position between a man and a woman. Right? And the Chief Justice wrote in 1986 that to not allow for the criminalization of homosexual sodomy would go against 5 millennia of moral teaching. Now, if that's what you're faced with, and it isn't until 2005 in a case called Lawrence and Gardner versus Texas, in which the Supreme Court says that you can't criminalize this stuff. And then in a case called Obergefell versus Hodges, the Supreme Court now says that you can have gay marriage. And the stigma associated, and we now recognize that heterosexual people get AIDS. And so people talk to their doctors about this. There are treatment options for this. But in the 1980s, in 1982, when this guy died, there was such stigma that people didn't admit they were gay, and they sure as hell didn't admit that they had that disease, which made it enormously difficult to treat. Similar things have happened with COVID. People don't want to get tested because there's a stigma. They're terrified that people, will think badly of them. This is happening on college campuses right now. Students are becoming COVID positive, and they don't want to go get tested. And because they don't want to run the risk of, some colleges are penalized. If you become COVID positive and they found out you went to a party or something like that, or a super spreader event, they're taking action against students under student conduct codes. That makes it difficult to treat. It creates a public health hazard. And these are services that are hard to evaluate, right? So this value co-creation is important. And how do we reduce that? It's difficult, and in some instances you can't. Inseparability. This is related to inconsistency. You don't view the provider as distinct from the company. Companies that live the brand, like Southwest Airlines, Southwest is always there. Oh, I've never had a bad experience. When I was a vice president, we had to travel on American. Our company had all of these Americans so that we would get points and stuff like that. And I oftentimes was able, because I traveled so much, was able to upgrade to first class. And it was still, even in first class, I remember being chewed out by a ticket agent because I wasn't standing in the first class line and I had a first class ticket. And I thought, if this is the way you treat your first class passengers, I would hate to see how you treat your economy. That's not the way Southwest operates. I've never had a bad experience on Southwest. Southwest doesn't have all the frills. They don't have first class. They don't, everything. Well, they have free bags, so you don't pay for that. But but they're fun, and you don't separate the experience that you have with that gate agent from the company itself, right? You blame the company for that experience that you have with the gate agent. The interaction between the provider and the consumer means that they create this value together. Interaction is dependent upon the extent to which the customer must be present. Medical services, legal services, accounting services, financial services, you have to be present. You have to tell your financial planner what your goals are, when you want to retire, how much you want to, are you planning on living in your house? One of the things that's difficult about financial planning now is when my grandparents paid cash for their house, right? My grandfather hated banks. He'd gone through the Depression, lost all of his money in a bank that closed. Hated him, didn't trust him, paid cash for his house. And he lived in that house until they died. And then my grandmother sold it and moved out. She wanted to move into a high-rise condo that had a pool, and she did. But he paid for the house. If they were going to remodel, they remodeled the house several times. They paid cash for it. Most people don't do that now. Most people, the average homeowner stays 5 to 7 years in a home. That means you're never going to pay off a house. Is that important in financial planning? Yep. In terms of what you're going to have, when my parents bought a home, they planned on staying in that home for 30 years. We've lived in our home currently since 1986. That's unusual. It's paid for, right? But most people don't. So you have to tell people, you have to be honest with your financial planner. You have to be honest when goals change in order to get the best out of those services. You have to be honest with your lawyer. Tell them that you confessed, because at that point, it's not about whether or not you did it. It's about how much we're going to, what punishment level we're going to see. Inventory. Inventory for products may be perishable. If I am a wholesaler of produce, my produce may perish. But if I don't sell this head of lettuce today, I may still be able to sell it tomorrow or the next day. If I'm selling packaged goods like cereal, God knows the shelf life on cereal, because it contains no natural products anymore, as far as I can tell, is probably 25 years. So if I don't sell that cereal today, although I may have costs in terms of storage and inventory, and that may be costing me money, I can still sell it tomorrow. I am an attorney. I cannot right now be billing somebody. I bill at $400 an hour, right? I'm having an inventory cost. I can't be billing while I'm standing up here talking to you. And unlike the box of cereal, which I may be able to sell tomorrow, I will never get the 75 minutes back. I can't make it up tomorrow, right? There's only so many minutes in a day. And if I lose those and I'm not billing, I can't make that up, right? So if I'm a lawyer and I'm just sitting in my office and I have excess inventory, if I'm not doing something, I can't recoup that cost later on down the road. So the inventory costs are enormously high with regard to services. And having idle production means that you're not going to be able to recoup those losses, whereas you can with goods in many instances. The service continuum. So mixed companies, most companies are not just a service or a product. When we buy Dell computers from Dell for use in these classrooms, there's also a service component. If something happens, we can call customer support, right? With Microsoft, we can call customer support. So it's important, is a company primarily a product or is it primarily a service provider? And this becomes a big issue with regard to when we talked about environmental scanning in the regulatory environment. This is one of these areas where it becomes really critical to think about. So let's think about this. Under the UCC, the Uniform Commercial Code, which modifies classical contracts doctrine in a number of very important ways, one of those ways that it modifies classical contracts doctrine is that it includes outside of the contract something called the implied warranty of merchantability. Now, if I'm selling chairs in my garage sale, I don't have an implied warranty of merchantability because I am not a merchant dealing in goods of that kind. But if I'm a merchant that deals in goods of a certain kind, like chairs, right, there's an implied warranty of merchantability. What does that mean? It means that when I sit down in this chair, it should not fall over and injure me, right? It should be made reasonably well to withstand the ordinary use to which it is put. And if it doesn't, if the chair breaks, if I sit down in it and it topples over, I can sue the manufacturer under the implied warranty of merchantability. Now, the UCC only applies to a sale of goods. Now, most sales involve both, right? Sales of goods and sales of services. Warranties are a service. The implied warranty of merchantability is a service. Now, let's think about this. Why is this important? And why is the services continuum important? When you go over after class because you're starving and hungry and you have a lack of good taste and you order from the tool of the devil, Chick-fil-A, your crappy chicken sandwich, and they give you salmonella poisoning, can you sue them under the implied warranty of merchantability? If that sale is primarily a service, you can't. You're going to have to come up with some other theory. If it's primarily a good, you can. Which is it? Why is it that let's suppose that you're not someone of poor taste and ill breeding, but you're just starving and that's all we have over there and you don't have a car and it's raining and you've got class. And so you just are forced to select the tool of the devil, Chick-fil-A, and crappy coffee from Starbucks. And you get salmonella poisoning from Chick-fil-A. Can you sue them under the implied warranty of merchantability? I don't know. Clearly, the computer, let's suppose that I'm using this computer and it blows up. Something happens. The battery packs in these. In the early ages of cell phones, there were batteries. They used nickel-cadmium batteries, and they would blow up. The batteries in those electric skateboard things that you people ride around on, those have batteries that have been known to blow up and explode. Now that's a product that has a service that's tangential to it, right? Like the service warranty, getting it fixed, things like that. That's a service that's tangential to the product. It's primarily the product. So when the computer blows up on me, I can sue under the implied warranty of merchantability. If the battery goes bad or the power source goes bad and it blows up, that's clearly a product, I think. Because the service that's associated, being able to call customer support, is tangential to the product. But is food in fast food really what you're paying for? Is it the product that you're really paying for? What is it you're really paying for with crappy Chick-fil-A food? I think it's mostly the service. It's mostly a convenience, isn't it? I mean, if you really want good chicken, you're gonna come up with a recipe yourself and go fry the chicken, if that's what you really want. What is it that you want when you buy McDonald's, McDouble or Chick-fil-A's chicken? You're really, what you're really paying for is the service, isn't it? It's not having to cook it. It's not having to clean the dishes after you cook it or the stove. It's the convenience of it, being able to throw that wrapper away. I think it's mostly a service, right? So is it really a good or is it a service? Distinguishing between the company's core offerings, whether it's a product or a service, can be difficult. Is it, in some products it's very clear. The service that comes along with this iPhone is tangential to the product itself. But with regard to food, if you go to a restaurant, let's say it's even less clear. A restaurant, what is it that you're paying for when you go to, let's say, a fine dining place? There used to be a place that one of the most expensive restaurants in Oklahoma City, it's now closed, it's become something else, was called the Coach House. There used to be a restaurant in Guthrie. It was Oklahoma's only 4-star restaurant in the entire state. It was called the Sand Plum Restaurant. It was the top floor of the Victor Building. It was there when I was a kid growing up. It was a great place to go. They had this beautiful mural, and what is it you're really paying for when you go to a restaurant like that? It's not just the food. It's really having somebody come, having a waiter in a tuxedo shirt and a bow tie and a cummerbund serve you and call you Mr. So-and-so or Madam, and pull your chair out when you get up and put your napkin on your lap and prepare the food. You're paying for the skill level of the chef, right? It's not really just about the food. It's about all of that stuff, about having an experience and not just the product itself, right? So it can be difficult to determine. We can classify services in a number of ways. We can classify it by the method of delivery. Is it delivered by people like lawyers, doctors? Some of these things have changed over time in the way that we classify them. Equipment. It used to be that banking was largely a personal service. People used to use, I would be willing to bet there are people in this room who have never written a check in your life. How many of you have never written a check in your life? Everyone in here has written a check? Wow, I had 4 people in my first class that had never, ever written. Why would you write a check? You've got a debit card, right? Huh?
For graduation, you know how to write checks. So it's part of this.
It was required that you write a check?
Yeah, but I graduated in 2004.
Okay, all right. So, there's one. A lot of people have never written a check, right? In the olden days, when I was a kid growing up, maybe some of you got checks from your grandma who still writes checks, because grandma still loved to write checks, right? They send you a check for your birthday. You had to take that check down to the bank and deposit it, and that involved a teller who would run it through a system and encode it, and then those checkable deposits were passed on to banks, because most banks weren't members of the Fed, so they'd have to pass it on to a bank that was, and then they would go through a clearinghouse. You don't have to do that anymore. If you get checks, if somebody actually writes you a check, it's largely, you can take a picture of it and deposit it in your account instantly, right? So it's gone from being a personal service to being one that's largely provided by equipment, electric utilities, e-trade, online banking, things like that. We can also classify services as profit or non-for-profit or governmental. Government-sponsored, federal, state, local. The United States Postal Service, for example, is a quasi-governmental service that's provided, fire, police, roads, highways, so we can classify services in these different ways. And those are going to be important when we think about how those services are delivered, how they're evaluated, and how they are funded, right? Well, classifying services becomes important. Then evaluating services. We can also classify them how purchases are made. Successful service companies understand, Hilton, Marriott, they understand how customers make purchase decisions. Historically, in the hotel business, people had to call the hotel and see if they had reservations. Right now, people want to do what? When you book a hotel, you want to do what? You can now, Marriott has a way, and Hilton have ways, that you don't even have to deal with somebody at the front desk. You can check in on your mobile device, and you can use your phone now in many of the hotels as what? As your key to open the door. They enable your electronic device to basically communicate with the door and serve as your room key. They understand how consumers evaluate services. They do constant polls. They hire secret shoppers for Marriott and Hilton and Texas Roadhouse and things like that. My niece used to work at Texas Roadhouse when she was going to school at OSU, and she was what they call a super trainer because she had been comp shopped 7 times in her career there, and she always had the highest marks. So they made her their lead trainer at that Texas Roadhouse in Stillwater, right? So they understand how services are evaluated. You get customers to actually give you feedback. You give them free stuff and get them to be secret shoppers, things like that. They determine how to have a different advantage. What makes Marriott's full-service hotels different than Best Western? I would say there's not a lot of distinguishing difference between Marriott and Hilton at their top levels, but there's a big difference between Marriott and IHG, which is Holiday Inn, right? Or Marriott and Best Western. What makes them better, right? What gives them an advantage? So to assess the quality, consumers in their own mind compare their expectations about how a service should be to their actual experience. What is my idealized idea of what the service, massage, for example, should be versus what I actually got? And the difference between expectations and experience, we can identify through a gap analysis that looks at things like reliability. How consistent can we get those services? Hotel services, Marriott and Hilton and things like that, they've become very good at value co-creation and being reliable by getting people to sign up for things like Marriott Bonvoy and tracking what is it that you like. Do you primarily travel for business or pleasure? What floor do you prefer to stay on, right? Are you going to a full service Marriott, or are you primarily a consumer of the Marriott Courtyards or the less full service brands, right? The tangibility, those things that we can touch, taste, see, hear. How do we assess those? The responsiveness of our agents to the consumer. How much time do people have to spend waiting? The assurance that we provide them, and then finally the empathy. We know from the services literature that people actually, if there is a services failure but there's a good recovery, they may be happier. And I'll give you an example of how this works. Airlines. Airlines oftentimes overbook. They use complex models to determine that about 10 to 15% of people who book airlines don't actually make it to the airline. They're business travelers, something happens, and they don't actually make it. All mathematical models, by the way, are wrong. Some mathematical models are useful. All of them are wrong, right? When we look at the R, which is the rate of spread of infectious disease, they're all wrong. Unless you have a disease like Ebola, which has highly specific It's a highly specific mode of transmission, and it's a highly specific set of characteristics of the disease. All of the R, if you look at the variance in the R and the spread of COVID, for example, it's a huge variance, which means that the models are highly unreliable, right? But they're useful. They're still useful. Airlines use these same kinds of models to predict inventory demand, right? And then they price based on those. And they oftentimes overbook by 10 to 20% based on their models. Those models are oftentimes wrong. They're useful because they provide enough reliability that we can have some assurance. But what happens when everybody shows up? What do the airlines do? Southwest is one of the best at this. They don't just start bumping people automatically. They will get to that point, but they start offering, and Southwest actually offers really good benefits. And people are actually happier. I've done this a lot. I flew like 8 flights in a row on Southwest that were completely free because they kept overbooking, and they would give you free airline passes for anywhere in the country, right? Not just a dollar amount. And I was actually happier with the service's failure than I was, because A, they showed a lot of empathy. The gate agents showed a lot of empathy, and they recovered from that. And the recovery involves that empathetic feeling. So those are the ways that we assess services quality and how we're doing. Any questions? All right, so Thursday you have to work on the exam. I will have it up by class time on Thursday. I'll probably have it up tomorrow. There will be critical thinking questions in that you will have to calculate. There will not be an essay, however. It will be on D2L, and you have a week to complete it from Thursday to Thursday. All right? It was good to see you all. It's been a long time. I will see you a week from today. All right? Thanks.